Hello again. Okay, yay, new series. This one is going to be a shorter one because the Biggie and Tupac one was so long, and if you haven't seen it, please go watch it. I'm begging you, please. Anyways, this one is going to be shorter, but we're going to talk about Woodstock, and not just Woodstock, but the Monterey Pop Festival, which was the inspiration for Woodstock, and the Altamont Free Festival, which happened after Woodstock, and pretty much went down in flames. It's going to be very interesting. If you have ever wondered about Woodstock, you want to see some old photos of it, this is the video to watch for sure. So first, we're going to talk about the Monterey Pop Festival. It happened before Woodstock, but before we even get into that, we need to talk about the Summer of Love that everybody refers to. It's not 1969 when Woodstock happened, it was 1967 when the Monterey Pop Festival happened. It was the spotlight of the hippie phenomenon. San Francisco was definitely the hub, which also happened to be right where Monterey Pop Festival was. It was a summer of exploration, of realizing things. No, it wasn't that. Maybe with psychedelics, maybe. But as one of the articles that I read put it, it was all about the key ideas of the 1960s rebellion: communal living, political decentralization, and environmental awareness. And then also on the side of that, you're gonna get some sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So the Monterey Pop Festival was June 16th to 18th of 1967, and I know that it says 17th to 19th, but Britannica says 16th to 18th, and I trust Britannica with my life. So this is also not the official poster. Go look up the official poster. I can't show it because that is nudity, but it's very cool. So the festival was originally created by Alan Pariser and a dude named Ben Shapiro. I shit you not, I was just as confused as you hearing that information, but he was just a businessman in the music industry at the time, not the Ben Shapiro we know today. And Lou Adler, who was a producer and a songwriter. He's worked with people like Carole King, Sam Cooke, the Mamas and Papas, big deal. So Lou Adler says that he conceptualized this when he was talking with Paul McCartney, Cass Elliot, and John and Michelle Phillips of the Mama and Papas. And he was talking about how pop and rock just weren't considered art like other music forms, and he really wanted to get that through to America. And this was his idea. And Paul McCartney, as well as Mick Jagger and Brian Jones, were all on the board of governors of this event. And what this was going to be was basically the first rock festival ever, and really something that brought shape to the counterculture hippie movement of the time. And later, Ben Shapiro and Alan Pariser actually dropped out, I believe, but they added in John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas and Derek Taylor, who was a publicist. So they still had a full group going on this. And so originally, it was supposed to be a paid festival. They were going to pay the artists. You are going to have to pay to get in. So originally, it was going to be for profit, but once Alan Pariser and Ben Shapiro dropped out, they decided to make it non-profit, and the proceeds would go towards a charity, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that meant that the artists wouldn't be paid either. And some artists were not down for that, as you can probably imagine. That is part of why the Beach Boys dropped out of this concert, although they did say they were also dealing with some stuff internally regarding substance abuse. But Ravi Shankar actually was the only person who was paid for this concert. We will talk about him in a minute. But he was part of the original deal with Alan Pariser and Ben Shapiro, so he still got paid, but nobody else did. They didn't leave the artists completely high and dry, though. They did give them transportation, a place to stay, free food and drink. They had nice sound systems set up for them, and they also had the green room, which they think might have been one of the first green rooms ever where artists get ready to perform. But lots of artists did perform, and I think that's because they wanted to hang out with other artists. They wanted to hang out with other people who shared their ideas and values. And also, keep in mind, the counterculture was very anti-commercialism, so I'm sure that the idea of performing for free was actually kind of appealing. So all the money from the concert, from the ticket sales, went to the Monterey Pop Festivals Association, their foundation, but specifically the first year it went to founding a music program in Harlem that Paul Simon sponsored, and I love him. And Simon and Garfunkel was one of the first bands to sign on, as well as the Mamas and the Papas, and they were two big names, and that really helped them to attract attention from other artists and get other big names on board. The tickets were between $3 and $6.50, which today is more like $25 to $55, but I think they were per day. Seems kind of in line with music festivals now, although there are some very pricey ones out there today. And originally, when they found the plot of land they were going to do it on, they thought this was going to be a very chill vibes kind of deal. But they quickly realized that was not going to be the case because around 100,000 to 200,000 people were going to show up. And yes, that was more than they expected and more than they could hold, really. Now, the local government in Monterey was not too pleased with the festival. They really felt like it would get out of hand. I don't blame them, but eventually they were convinced to keep letting the festival happen. And they even got Monterey Peninsula College to let them use their football field for camping. This is one of the campings. Although people did stay in motels, their cars, on the actual fairground. So this wasn't the only place they camped. And this festival was over the course of a few days. So all these people camping, they're eating, they're drinking, they're sleeping, they're having sexual relations, they're doing whatever substances they like to do, all on the fairgrounds, right there. So they're camping out on the fairgrounds, doing whatever they like to do. And there's also musicians wandering around, performing. Of course, it was all super fun, but they were also talking about important topics. They were talking about war, poverty, equality. All of those things were big parts of the counterculture movement and parts of the songs that the musicians sang. So really, it became a kind of place where people from all over the country could discuss their views, especially people with similar values and ideas who considered themselves part of this counterculture. They also had a filmmaker, though, filming the entire thing, and yes, you can watch that film. The age range for the music festival, as you can probably imagine, was teenagers to around 30 years old. And the fashion, the reports say there were tambourines, long hair, beards, lots of people had painted faces, and apparently a lot of people decided to go with the Cowboys and Indians theme, which is super offensive. I mean, I'm a little bit not surprised because it's the 60s, but it's super offensive. And I don't know the exact weather conditions, but I do know that some reports said that it rained overnight, and people were literally sleeping in the rain, just camping out there, and they basically just wiped the mud off themselves in the morning and kept going. And even though this was a hippie festival, they did have stuff that festivals need, press, cops, although the cops apparently were wearing flowers that people had given them, and by the second day they actually dismissed a bunch of their officers because they realized they didn't need them and these people were very peaceful. Also, despite the strong smell in the air of a certain herbal medicine, shall we say, we all know what I'm talking about here, nobody was arrested except one guy and he ended up getting released. So things went smoothly. But obviously that one herbal medicine was not the only substance around. There was also a lot of acid there, and the cops just turned a blind eye. And last thing I gotta mention before we get into the performers is that there were also members of Hell's Angels there, which is a biker gang. We're not gonna talk too much about them there. They were known for being violent, but they didn't do anything at this concert, but keep their name in mind. So performances at Monterey Pop, Janis Joplin, and this was also one of the concerts that made her famous. And Lou Adler has even said that this was one of the greatest performances of all time for him. Otis Redding was also there, although he was on the fence about it because in the past he had not been very well received by white audiences live, but he decided to go for it anyways. And he was one of the only black performers there. Obviously, Jimi Hendrix was also there. We'll get to him in a minute. But at the time, Otis Redding was way more famous, and he was doing straight R&B, no rock and roll. And as I said, Otis Redding was one of the only black performers there. There were other black performers invited, but a lot of them said that they felt that this was going to be a Whitey's festival, which is funny. But I also get their point that they felt like it was going to be uncomfortable for them, and that's really all that matters. Fair enough. Also, side note, another black artist that was asked to perform at Monterey Pop was Chuck Berry, and his response was, "I don't work for free." Good job, Chuck. The Who was also there. They're a British band. They're known for destroying their instruments, and they had a chat with Jimi Hendrix beforehand. Basically, the lead singer, Pete Townsend, and Jimi Hendrix kind of had an argument before they went on about who would get to go on first because they both liked to destroy their instruments, and it was kind of a competition of who would make a bigger scene, even though Jimi Hendrix wasn't big yet. But ultimately, the Who won out and they got to go on first. And of course, they destroyed their entire set, as one does, including setting off a smoke bomb, which really scared everybody, actually. However, it ultimately riled up the crowd. They were all happy, yay, yay, yay. The only person who wasn't happy was Lou Adler, who had paid for all of the sound stuff and was pretty upset that some of his stuff was getting destroyed in the process. The Grateful Dead also performed at Monterey Pop, and they actually were known to play for free quite often, so this was nothing new to them. The only real issue that happened during their concert was that people started getting up on stage and dancing with them, and Lou Adler got pissed and made people get off the stage. And then Jimi Hendrix performs, and this is one of the performances that made him famous too, just like Janis. He was super loud, super vibrant, as is his style both in fashion and in music. And at the end, according to a writer for Esquire who went to the festival, he humped the amplifier, then turned and sat astride the guitar so that its neck extended like a third leg. For a few tender moments, he caressed the strings. And then he set his guitar on fire. Of course, people went wild for this, and needless to say, he really one-upped The Who in that moment. And Pete Townsend of The Who supposedly backstage said, "For me it was an act, and for him it was something else. It was an extension of what he was doing." Basically, he didn't feel like Jimmy was stealing anything from him. It was more like, this is authentically a part of Jimmy, not just some persona. So the last person I'm going to talk about in the lineup on Monterey Pop was Ravi Shankar. He was a famous Indian sitar player. And he was a huge influence on George Harrison, member of the Beatles, and the Beatles group as a whole on their sound in their later albums like Revolver and my favorite, Rubber Soul. And he insisted that everybody watching his concert be completely sober. He didn't want anybody to be under the influence of anything, even tobacco. He wanted full attention on his music. And of course, his concert was a huge success, and apparently also a lot of it was very improvised. And other notable people who performed at the Monterey Pop Festival included Eric Burdon and the Animals, which, if you watch my 27 clip series, Eric Burdon was very good friends with Jimi Hendrix, the Byrds, Steve Miller Band, Canned Heat, who was also in my 27 series, the Buffalo Springfield, Lou Adler's Lonely Hearts Band, Paul Butterfield Blues Band, lots of big names. However, after the concert, even though the town and the police seemed to have no issue with it at the time, decided that they were firmly against ever having anything like this again. Although I'm sure that that decision has as much to do with their opinions as it does other people's opinions in the city, and the notion that just because it goes well once doesn't mean it's going to go well every time, which we will see. However, this one did go well. It was the Summer of Love, and I know it's crazy to think that Woodstock wasn't in the Summer of Love, but it was not, and we're about to talk about that. And post Summer of Love, summer of 1967, people really got shot back to earth, in a sense, back to reality. The Guardian specifically painted a really good picture of this. I liked what they said, but essentially their point was that those things that were considered so bohemian and beautiful at the time, like living a nomadic lifestyle, taking psychedelics to open your mind, free love, all ended up really being a gateway to things like homelessness, addiction, mental illness, SA. Because as much as we might want people to be all good, all pure of soul, we might want life to be all sweet and fair and peaceful and loving, we have to deal with the harder parts of humanity that don't make those kind of things possible. And the Summer of Love wasn't really in tune with those things. So the summer of 69 is when Woodstock happened, and now we're a couple years past the Monterey Pop Festival, and it is not the Summer of Love at all. For example, this was the year that Jim Morrison was convicted of obscene behavior for flashing a crowd. And I did see comments on the 27 Club series saying that never happened, but it did indeed definitely happen. Now, whether he really did flash the crowd, whether the cops, the judge, the jury were against him in some way, that's all another story that could definitely be debated, but he was convicted. He didn't serve the time because he passed away, and he was pardoned later on. We're talking about 1969. So some happy things that happened. The moon landing, the Brady Bunch, our first black Avenger, the Falcon, and Abbey Road was released. On the other hand, we had the Stonewall riots, which was our first step towards LGBTQ rights, but still a tragic event. We also got confessions to Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr.'s deaths. The Black Panthers were constantly at odds with the government. Stuff was happening with that all the time, as well as race riots in Connecticut. And to top it all off, this dude, who I think we probably recognize, and this dude were out there. They were out in the world. All this to say, 1969 was definitely not a Summer of Love vibe. It was actually a pretty tough year. But in the midst of all that, Woodstock, August 15th to 18th of 1969, heavily inspired by the Monterey Pop Festival, appears. It was conceptualized and created by Michael Lang, Artie Cornfield, John Roberts, and Joel Rosenman, and this is Michael Lang specifically, and they were all movers and groovers in the music industry. And their idea for it was that it would be a music and art fair, and it would be 3 days of peace and music. Originally, it was supposed to be at an industrial park in Wallkill, New York, but they actually ended up deciding as a town that they did not want a large music festival there, and they actually sent Howard Mills, who owned the industrial park, threats until he decided, I've had enough. But then a guy named Elliot Tiber, who eventually wrote a memoir on Woodstock, suggested a plot of land that he had to them, but it wasn't really going to work, so instead he referred them to his milkman. And that is how Woodstock ended up on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York. Just this random guy, he's not random anymore, his name is Max Yasgar, but just his farm. They rented it for $50,000, which is close to $400,000 today. But the people in his town were just as unhappy as the people in Wallkill. Turns out they did not want a music festival, but Max didn't give a damn. Also before the concert, Elliot Tiber actually also got a lot of threats, as did I'm sure Max. And I saw some reports that they had sponsors like Pepsi and Haagen-Dazs, but I couldn't really confirm that, but this is the dairy farm again. He's just so adorable. He's gonna get cuter as this story goes on. They were actually paying artists though for this festival. The first big ones to sign on were Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Jefferson Airplane, and of course that helped them to get other big names. One of the issues they faced though, which we'll see in a minute, was that none of the caterers or event people were really prepared for a crowd of the size that Woodstock became, and it became a problem. So this is actually not the original poster design that they had planned. Apparently it was a naked woman in a psychedelic design, but the higher-ups didn't like that, so they had to change it, and that's how we got this one. The tickets were only $6 per day, which is about $45 today, so around $135 for the entire 3 days, and they sold about 100,000 tickets. And based on those numbers, they were expecting about 50,000 people per day, and that is what they told Max Yasgar, who owned the farm. That's also what they told the people of Bethel, New York. However, Michael Lang says that he kind of knew the whole time that they were looking at more like 250,000 people a day, but he didn't want to scare them, so he chose not to disclose that. So the first big problem that they had at this concert was that they didn't get the fences up or the ticket booths up in time, so people could really just come on in. You didn't need a ticket, and they had plenty of people without a ticket. I mean, look at this sea of people. 450,000 people ended up coming to this dairy farm in Bethel, New York that was only 600 acres. I'm no mathematician, but I'm pretty sure that that is not enough. Just like Monterey Pop, there was a bunch of camping, as you can probably see. People were also camping even in their cars on the median of the highway, because lots of people actually abandoned their cars on the highway because there was so much traffic. They just got out and walked to the concert, came back at night, slept in their car. They also had their performers playing pretty much 24 hours, so if you wanted to listen to music all day and all night, you could definitely do that. And it also did rain. People were covered in mud at points. I've been to music festivals where it rains, and it's miserable, so props to them for sticking it out. And of course, it was mainly the same crowd as Monterey Pop as well, hippies, counterculture, and most of the performers too were part of that counterculture actively. And in fact, free love was taken quite literally. Apparently there was many people just seen having sex openly in the concert grounds, and I'm guessing a fair few children were conceived at Woodstock. There were also people that were completely nude, just chilling, people skinny dipping in the lake that was on the grounds. And if they weren't completely nude, there were tons of people who were barefoot, which we'll get into in a second. And of course they had the music, but it was also an arts festival, and they did have people selling accessories, crafts, and such, plus there's people selling food, snow cones, whatever, that a normal festival would sell. Somewhat unlike a normal festival though, supposedly there was a place with a sign that said drugstore, like a pharmacy, but they were actually taking that very literally and selling psychedelics for very cheap. And they did end up with a food and water shortage and very few bathrooms, if any, that I've seen. So as I mentioned before, they did end up with some food and water shortages. Food for Love was one of the main caterers there, and they were quite frankly completely unprepared for the mass of people that was about to come upon them. The mistake they made, though, was that when the food shortage came around, they decided that they would raise the price of a burger from 25 cents to $1, which people really did not like. Again, these are anti-commercialism hippies. And they burnt their stands down, a couple of them at least. But supposedly, members of the community of Bethel donated stuff, as well as volunteers. And this is obviously not Max Yasgar, but this is all to say that it was his dairy farm. He sold people and gave away some of his butter, his cheese, his milk. And when he found out that they were charging people for water, he put up a sign on his barn that said free water and let people come and get water for free. Please, this man is so precious. There was also plenty of people working there, as well as medics, press. There was a documentary made about it too, which you can also watch. And this place called the Hog Farm was also a huge contributor to the festival. They were a communal pig farm, communal living area. But for this event, they had a free children's playground, just in case you brought your kid. They had free food. They had a tent for people who were having a bad trip. And they also were throwing pies and seltzer water at people that misbehaved. What an interesting tactic. And I mentioned before that a lot of people were barefoot. Well, they actually had an engineer there who had made wells for water, and he put quite a bit of chlorine into the water. Not enough for it to be unsafe, but enough that if people were washing their feet with it, the chlorine would help them to not get infections because they're running around barefoot. And the chief medical officer said that there really wasn't any violence and things ran pretty smoothly. Although there were about 5,000 people who were injured or sick by the end, and 3 people did pass away. One of them passed away from an overdose on the H. One of them was ran over by a tractor, which no clue why there were tractors operating at this festival. And then one man, his appendix burst. And there were also reported to have been about 8 miscarriages. There were also some drug arrests at this festival. About 80 people were arrested for stuff like that. Considering that there was 450,000 people, I think we can safely assume that more than 80 people were engaging in that kind of stuff, so that's pretty low. So the first performer at Woodstock that we're going to talk about is Richie Havens. He was an African-American folk singer, and this concert really made him famous, especially when the documentary came out. He performed for 3 hours, which, God, that is so long, but he had to because other performers were stuck in traffic. And of course, if you perform for 3 hours, you're probably going to get through your entire repertoire, so then he had to start improvising. Next up was Ravi Shankar. He performed at Woodstock also, and he performed Through the Rain. Good for him. Joan Baez also performed in Light Rain, and she was 6 months pregnant, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning. God, I cannot imagine. Supposedly, though, there was actually very little applause for her, and she actually said, "Is anyone out there?" And a reporter who went to the festival said, "Yes, they were, in the thousands, stoned, zapped, laid out on the pasture turf." And he also said that he thinks the applause in the documentary, if you watch it, you'll hear there's an applause after Joan Baez, he thinks that was actually dubbed in. Santana also performed at Woodstock, which it's hard to believe that there was a time when Santana was not known by everyone, but they weren't very well known at Woodstock. They had actually just released their first album, so this was their first huge gig, and what a first huge gig to have. However, Carlos Santana was actually given acid beforehand by Jerry Garcia, and that did not go well for him. Although you couldn't really tell by the way he was playing.
Of course, the guitar neck, the neck of the guitar started wavering, like a snake, and I was like, oh. So I just started making faces because I was trying to keep it tame, I was trying to keep it from slithering all over the place.
And y'all should really go watch the full interview because it's honestly hilarious. Also, side note, does anyone remember when Santana came out with a shoe line? Because that literally feels like a fever dream, especially talking about all of this. So the Grateful Dead also performed. Although they did have a lot of issues before going on stage because the stage was apparently completely flooded and their equipment was too heavy. But they made it work and they ended up doing a 50-minute, yes, 5-0 version of Turn On Your Love Light. Creedence Clearwater Revival also performed, and they ended up performing in the middle of the night because, as John Fogerty said, that the Grateful Dead went on too long, supposedly. And even though not as many people got to hear them play, they were fantastic, of course. Janis Joplin was also at Woodstock. And she had just started her solo career, actually, but a lot of people supposedly said that she had lost some power without the band. The Who was also at Woodstock, and they started playing at 5 a.m. I would never wake up for any band that early. Nope. Abby Hoffman actually interrupted their set, though. He was a member of the White Panther Party, which was an anti-racist group. Obviously, they got their name from the Black Panthers. And he got up on stage and started trying to make a speech, but Pete Townsend kicked him off. Jimi Hendrix did not end up playing until 9 a.m. Monday morning. It was Friday through Sunday. Monday morning, 9 a.m. he started playing because of all the rain delays. And it's crazy because we just talked about how his Monterey Pop Festival performance was one of the ones that really shot him into stardom. Well, 2 years later at Woodstock, he was the highest paid performer. They actually had to tell other performers that he was doing 2 shows so that they wouldn't ask for more money because he was getting so much more. And also, as part of his contract, he had to be the last performer of the festival, which is why he ended up playing at 9 a.m. But he wanted to be the last word, which makes sense, to be fair, because he was the headliner. Although his band had actually broken up right before this, so he had a different band. But even though they were a little concerned that maybe it wouldn't go as planned, they ended up pulling it off for sure. And his Star Spangled Banner medley was iconic. Other performers at Woodstock included Melanie Sofska, who wasn't supposed to play, but the Incredible String Band didn't want to play in the rain. Arlo Guthrie, Woody Guthrie's son, This Land Is My Land, This Land Is Your Land. Country Joe McDonald of Joe and the Fish, who did a solo performance before Santana. John Sebastian of The Lovin' Spoonful, who was not supposed to do a solo performance, but ended up doing it while other acts were getting ready. Do You Believe in Magic is Lovin' Spoonful. And the band, who were Bob Dylan's backing, even though Bob Dylan didn't end up coming, even though he was invited. So after Woodstock, there was actually so much damage to Max Yasgar's farm that they ended up having to pay him an extra $50,000 just so that he could keep his livestock through the winter. They also had to refund a ton of people their tickets because lots of people didn't end up getting to go because of all of the traffic. They didn't make it, even though plenty of people without tickets did make it, which kind of sucks for those people. And just like Monterey Pop, after Woodstock, the newly appointed mayor of Bethel decided to pass laws to make sure that Woodstock could never happen again or anything like it. And the townspeople rejoiced. And as of 2017, the dairy farm where Woodstock happened is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And also, I have to mention it, this couple met at Woodstock. This is them. And they finally found a picture of themselves at Woodstock, and here they are today. And they're still married. It's the cutest story. You should definitely look it up. And now we're going to talk about the Altamont Festival. And if you were thinking that you were only here for Woodstock, I promise you, you want to stick around for this because this is true crime. So the concert was held December 6th of 1969. It was just one day. And they originally wanted to hold it at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, but it didn't work out, so they settled on Altamont Speedway. It was said to be a Christmas and Hanukkah gift from the Rolling Stones. So naturally, as a gift, it was free, although it did cost them $250,000, which is about $2 million today, although publicity is priceless. Ended up being bad publicity, but they did have some doctors, psychiatrists, restrooms, people hired to film the event, and they also hired event security. And who did they choose? A biker gang, Hell's Angels. They agreed to do security for $500 worth of beer, which is about $3,700 today. What a bargain! Nothing could go wrong. Things could go wrong, and they're going to. And now some say that it was the Stones that suggested that they hired them. Some say it was the Grateful Dead. There's a lot of finger pointing after the fact, so I guess we'll never know. And supposedly they were expecting about 10,000 people. Just a quiet little concert. At this point, I'm thinking that they are either incredibly naive or they're fibbing a little bit like Michael Lang. And about 300,000 people ended up going. So the traffic, of course, was once again terrible. And they were once again sleeping in their cars, in tents, in sleeping bags the night before the concert. And there was also reports that they were heard all night the night before the concert, making music, having fun, smoking a particularly pungent herb that was just all in the air. And there were also reports of people running around in the nude. Of course, casual. But I think we can safely assume that as with the other concerts, there was quite a bit of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll going on. Specifically drinking, herbs, psychedelics, all that good stuff. It was happening. We all know it was happening. And again, if you were here for Woodstock, stick with me for this. This is about to get crazy. So supposedly the night before, there was a guy who was having a bad trip on acid and jumped from a 40-foot overpass and only broke his pelvis. What a lucky boy. But this was clearly the start of the mayhem to come. The day of, when the Rolling Stones arrived, a boy ran at Mick Jagger, yelling that he hated him and hit him, and apparently the Hells Angels quickly took care of the situation. Yikes for that dude. Multiple people, though, reported the Hells Angels kind of being a nuisance, and worse, which we'll get into in a minute, but they were wasted off of their beer money, possibly on other things. I think we can kind of let our minds wander to what that might be. And basically, they were hitting, throwing, beating up people left, right, and center, and apparently also trying to drive their motorcycle through the crowd sometimes. And some people said that most of the Hells Angels were behaving and doing the right thing, and it was just some of them or just the initiates. Whatever the case, even if it was just a few of them, they were wrecking the entire thing. 2 babies were also born in Altamont behind the stage because women went into premature labor, which I can imagine the stress of a concert, that could do it. And plenty of other people had horrible trips and probably PTSD from this event. And 4 people total passed away at Altamont. 1 was intentionally done by a member of the Hells Angels. 1 man drowned after jumping into an aqueduct while he was having a bad trip. And at least 2 men died when a truck ran over 4 people who were camping by the festival grounds. But before we get into those, we're going to talk about the other performances. The Jefferson Airplane performed, and supposedly Marty Balin of the Jefferson Airplane was punched in the face by a member of the Hells Angels. Then Ace of Cups performed. They're an all-girl rock band. And the lead singer, Denise Jukes, had a beer bottle thrown at her head and she fractured her skull. She was actually pregnant at the time, but she was okay, luckily. She did say, though, that people were throwing cans and bottles everywhere, which is so dangerous. Why do people do that? I don't know. Santana also performed once again, although during his concert, apparently a group of Hells Angels went across the stage, jumped into the audience, and beat a man with pool cues and pipes. So kind, so gentle. Good security. So it's now time for the headliner, the Rolling Stones, who this whole concert was their thing, to come on. They perform Sympathy for the Devil, and then they perform Under My Thumb. And during that song, there was an altercation between an 18-year-old boy named Meredith Hunter and some members of Hells Angels, who were hired for security. There are multiple accounts of what happened. I'm going to splice them together for y'all, but I will say I'm going heavily off of the cameraman's accounts of what they saw in the camera footage. There is camera footage of this. You can look it up online. I obviously can't show it here. Supposedly, the reason that they think the Hells Angels were after Meredith was because he was running at the stage and had been doing so multiple times, unsuccessfully, of course. But a lot of other people had also been doing this. He was not the only one. One witness said that they pulled him by the hair to yank him away, and he pulled away from them, and then they punched him. And after that, supposedly, he ran away from them, and they chased him through the crowd. There were accounts that they stabbed him in the back multiple times while he was running, but it's unclear if that happened. If it did happen, he still made his way back. And this is Meredith Hunter in the green. So supposedly he stuck out his tongue and then reached into his coat and started to pull something out, which is when his girlfriend started yelling and pulling at him to get him to stop, I'm guessing. And it looked apparently like Meredith pulled out a firearm out of his coat and may or may not have fired it. It's really unclear if he did or not. Hells Angels claims that he did. Others aren't sure. After that, multiple members of Hells Angels came towards him, and then one of them picked up a weapon and then sprung on him and started stabbing him. And he did have 5 wounds, but there's only 2 visible instances on camera of it happening, so that does suggest that he may have been stabbed beforehand when they were chasing him through the crowd as well. Now, the Grateful Dead was also supposed to perform. They did not get to perform because of all that happened, but they did have a lot to say about Rolling Stones and Hells Angels. Supposedly, a reporter called them and a member of their team said that the Rolling Stones screwed us all over royally and that they had spent their own money on transportation and then they never got to play and they never saw any money from it. She did say also that the Stones are just not nice people, you know, and also that the Hells Angels' behavior should have been expected, and that one of them was nice, but other than that, they were crummy animals. Specifically, a member of their team gave, not of the band, of their publicity team or something, gave a description, supposedly, of their behavior, and this was it, of Hells Angels. Until 4 a.m., getting drunker and drunker and punching out anyone who got in their reach. They burned all the packing crates for our spotlights, and at one time they threatened to set fire to the stage, but I guess they got loaded and forgot about it. I was bodily thrown off the stage by the Angels twice in a row. I guess they were just feeling mean, and I was handy. And I feel like that paints a portrait of it pretty well. Other performers that were at Altamont were Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, up here, as well as the Flying Burrito Brothers and In God We Trust. Supposedly, afterwards, one of the concert organizers asked a member of Hell's Angels to turn over the weapon that he used so that they could give it to the police, and I'm sure that went over real well, although I have no idea how it actually ended up. A member of Hell's Angels also spoke about it on the radio and said, "We were the biggest suckers of anybody. I'm not no peace creep by any sense of the word. I'm a violent cat when I gotta be, but I don't really want to be. Some of those dudes out there, they started kicking and trying to destroy our bikes, and that made it personal. They got thumped. They got. There ain't nobody going to kick my bike. It's my life and all I got." So many interesting phrases in that. As for the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards said basically that some Hells Angels were causing trouble, but many of them were behaving, and that it was also all the Grateful Dead's idea. He also made a point to talk about their previous concert in Hyde Park in the UK, and he said, "I think it illustrates the difference between the two countries. You can put 500,000 young English people together, and they won't start unaliving each other. That's the difference." Interesting point. I'm guessing, though, that the biker gang is the biggest differentiating factor, Keith. They also, as a group, had to stop playing Sympathy for the Devil at concerts for a while because people thought that that might have had something to do with it, since that's what they played right before it happened. And supposedly there was also a hit out on Mick Jagger by the Hells Angels, but it was discovered by the FBI. There was an investigation into the death, although not many people wanted to talk to the police, not even the cameraman, not even the footage that shows the member of Hells Angels' face, because they were afraid of retaliation. They did eventually get the information they needed, though, and Alan Pissarro was arrested in connection with the death. He was acquitted, though, because they found that he acted in self-defense since Meredith appeared to be pulling out a firearm. And one person summed it up and said, "There was no love, no joy at Altamont. It wasn't just the Angels, it was everybody. In 24 hours, we created all the problems of our society in one confined area: congestion, violence, and dehumanization." If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment any additions you might have or any thoughts or opinions. I'd love to hear them, as well as any series suggestions or new video suggestions in general. And if you want to see more of me and more of my series, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next week with another one.